Director Valeth arrived at Varath Colony 3 days after the siege ended, accompanied by a security detail large enough to occupy a small city. She found Yuna and Class Omega-12 helping colonists repair damage to the settlement while hunter teams from Alpha and Beta classes stood guard at the perimeter. Watching a wilderness that remained peaceful, Yuna sail, the director announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. You are hereby placed under arrest for unauthorized contact with hostile fauna and actions that endangered colonial security. The colonists who had been working alongside Yuna stopped and stared. Commander Hessek stepped forward with his scarred hands clenched. Director, this woman saved this colony. You cannot arrest her for that. I can arrest her for violating 17 different consortium regulations. Valeth replied coldly. She left the defensive perimeter without authorization. She made contact with creatures classified as extremely dangerous, and she took actions that could have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. But they did not result in loss of life, Hessek argued. Our actions ended the siege without further casualties. The outcome is irrelevant, the director said. The regulations exist to prevent unauthorized individuals from interfering with established protocols, and she violated those protocols flagrantly. Yuna stood quietly as security officers approached her with restraint devices. Kirith clicked frantically and moved to stand between her and the officers. His freeze response transformed into stubborn defiance. Drun's massive form joined him, and Mira spread all 4 arms wide in a gesture of protection. The rest of Class Omega-12 gather on their teacher. You will have to arrest all of us, Kirith said, his voice steady despite the clicking of his mandibles. Director Veleth's eyes narrowed with contempt. That can certainly be arranged. Before she could give the order, movement at the colony perimeter drew everyone's attention. Creatures were emerging from the wilderness, not attacking, not charging the barriers that had been rebuilt since the siege. Just watching Sketh workers appeared first, their many-legged forms settling into stillness at the edge of the cleared zone. Then larger shapes moved between the trees, forms that made experienced hunters reach for their weapons. Keth stalkers, the blade-limbed predators that Yuna had befriended in the Academy's restricted habitats. Void maws, the aggressive hunters that she had calmed during her evaluation. Exercise species that had never been seen together in the same territory. Creatures that should have been hunting each other, all gathered in silent witness. Director Veleth's crystalline eyes went wide with something that might have been fear. What is this? She demanded. Yuna looked at the gathering creatures and felt something she had never expected to feel: recognition flowing in both directions. They heard what happened, she said softly. They know that someone finally listened. The Sketh Queen emerged from the forest and moved to the front of the assembled creatures, her great form settling into a position that radiated authority. She looked at Yuna across the distance between them, and something passed between them that needed no words and no resonance projection. Understanding between species that the consortium had declared impossible. Director Commander Hessek said quietly, I do not think your security detail is sufficient for this situation. Valeth looked at the army of creatures surrounding the colony. Creatures that were not attacking, but whose presence made the message absolutely clear. If Yuna was harmed, there would be consequences that no amount of hunters could prevent. This changes nothing, the director said, but her voice had lost its certainty. The regulations still apply. The regulations are based on the assumption that these creatures cannot think or communicate. Yuna replied calmly. That assumption has been proven wrong, and regulations built on false assumptions have no authority. She stepped forward, and the security officers who had been approaching her stepped back. The Dominion doctrine says that sentient species are superior because we can think and communicate. But these creatures have been thinking and communicating for millions of years before we arrived. And the only reason we never noticed is because we never tried to listen. Tarvon from Class Alpha moved to stand beside Class Omega 12. And after a moment, other students from higher classes joined him. "She is right," Torvan said, his deep voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I have spent my entire life training to dominate creatures with resonance. But I watched her walk through thousands of Sketh without using any psychic ability at all. And she succeeded where 2 full hunter teams failed. More students moved to join the gathering around Yuna. And Director Valith found herself increasingly isolated. "This is mutiny," she said. But even she seemed to recognize how hollow the word sounded. "This is evolution," Yuna replied. "The galaxy is changing. And the consortium can either change with it or be left behind." She turned to address not just the director, but everyone present. Colonists and hunters and students and officials. Humanity came from a world where everything wanted to kill us. Where we were never the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous. And we survived not by dominating nature but by understanding it. By learning to read the signs that told us when to fight and when to run and when to simply wait. By recognizing that every creature has its own story and its own purpose. She gestured toward the assembled creatures watching from the perimeter. We called ourselves hunters. But we were never really hunting. We were just killing things we did not understand. And now we have a chance to try something different. The silence that followed was broken by the Sketh Queen making a sound that rippled through the assembled creatures. A clicking pattern that passed from species to species. It sounded almost like agreement. Director Valith looked at the creatures. Looked at the students and hunters who had sided with Yuna. And recognized that she had lost. "This is not over," she said as she turned and walked back toward her shuttle. "The consortium will have answers for this." But her words carried no weight, and everyone knew it 1 year later. The Hunter Academy had been transformed. The Dominion Doctrine was under formal review by the Consortium Council. And 3 colonial projects had been redesigned after contact specialists discovered that expansion plans would have damaged indigenous creature habitats. Class Omega 12 had graduated with full honors. The first Omega class in Academy history to achieve a 100% graduation rate. Kirith was now stationed on a frontier world, using his perfect stillness to approach creatures that motion triggered. Predators had made impossible to study. Drun had become the first Morkai to earn hunter certification, specializing in healing wounded creatures that traditional hunters would have simply killed. Mira coordinated communication efforts between colonial authorities and indigenous species. Her forearms perfectly suited for the complex gestures that certain creatures used as language. And Yuna stood before a new class of recruits in a training room that had been redesigned for a different kind of instruction. They were humans and Velith and Morkai and a dozen other species that had once been considered unsuitable for hunting, all gathered to learn the techniques that could not be taught through resonance projection. "The galaxy is full of conversations waiting to happen," Yuna told them. "Your job is not to shout louder than the creatures you encounter. Your job is to learn how to listen." Through the training room's windows, she could see the wilderness beyond the Academy's perimeter. Creatures moved there who had once attacked hunters on sight, who now paused and watched the buildings with something like curiosity. The monsters had found someone worth talking to, and humanity had found something far more valuable than another weapon to add to their arsenal. They had found a new way to make friends in a galaxy that had assumed they had nothing to offer somewhere out among the stars, on worlds that the consortium had not yet reached. Creatures were waiting to meet the strange soft beings who came not to conquer, but to understand. The conversation was just beginning. The transport ships descended through Varath's atmosphere in tight formation, carrying every available hunter from the Academy, along with their instructors and support personnel. Yuna pressed her face against the viewport and watched the planet grow larger beneath them. recognizing the same forests and mountains that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. Colony Vireth had been rebuilt 5 kilometers from the original settlement site, and its defensive barriers were supposed to be impenetrable. Those barriers were now flickering and failing under the pressure of thousands of Sketh, the same creatures that had destroyed Yuna's original colony. Through the viewport, she could see the swarm spreading across the landscape like a living carpet. More Sketh than any survey had ever recorded on a single world. Commander Hessek briefed the students during descent. 2 full hunter teams have already been killed attempting to break the siege, he said grimly. The Sketh are displaying coordinated behavior that has never been observed before, and standard resonance tactics are proving ineffective against their numbers. What is our objective? Asked Torvan from Class Alpha, a massive warrior whose resonance scores were among the highest in Academy history. Hold the perimeter until civilian evacuation is complete, Hessek replied. Alpha and Beta classes will lead the defense. Omega classes will assist with evacuation logistics. Yuna felt the familiar weight of being dismissed settle over her shoulders. They landed inside the colony's defensive perimeter, where exhausted security personnel were struggling to maintain the barrier generators against constant Sketh assault. The creatures hurled themselves at the flickering energy walls with mindless determination, their many-legged bodies crackling and burning as they died, only to be replaced immediately by more Class Alpha deployed to the primary breach points. And their combined resonance projection created waves of psychic pressure that pushed the Sketh back temporarily, but there were simply too many creatures. And each time the Alpha students drove back one wave, another surged forward to take its place. Yuna and Class Omega 12 were assigned to a civilian shelter near the colony center, tasked with organizing families for transport to the waiting ships. She worked mechanically, guiding frightened colonists toward evacuation points. While her mind kept returning to the Sketh swarm outside, something was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that everything was terrible, because everything was certainly terrible. Wrong in the sense that the Sketh behavior did not match what she remembered from 3 years ago. The creatures that had attacked her original colony had been hunters, picking off isolated colonists and dragging them underground. These Sketh were not hunting. They were throwing themselves against the barriers with no regard for their own survival, dying in waves that should have broken any animal's will to continue. That was not predator behavior. That was something else entirely. Kirith, she said suddenly. Take over here. I need to see something. Before her classmate could object, she was moving toward the perimeter. The defensive line was chaos when she arrived, with Alpha students straining to maintain their resonance projections while Sketh bodies piled against the barriers. Commander Hessek was coordinating from a command post, his scarred face tight with concentration. What are you doing here? He demanded when he saw Yuna approaching. Something is wrong with the swarm, she said. They are not behaving like predators. They are attacking our colony. That seems fairly straightforward. No, Yuna insisted. Predators do not sacrifice themselves like this. Predators retreat when the cost becomes too high. But these creatures keep coming no matter how many die. Hessek paused, considering her words despite the chaos around them. What are you suggesting? I need to get closer to them, Yuna said. Close enough to understand what they are actually doing. Absolutely not. You would be killed instantly. You do not know that, Yuna replied calmly. And if I am right about what is happening here, fighting them will only make things worse. Before Hessek could stop her, she was moving toward a breach point where the barrier had temporarily failed. Alpha students were falling back, their resonance reserves exhausted from hours of constant projection. Yuna walked through the gap they left and stepped outside the defensive perimeter. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The nearest Sketh turned toward her with their many eyes gleaming in the emergency lights, and she heard shouting behind her as hunters realized what she had done. She stood still and breathed slowly and reached for the same state of mind that had saved her. Life 3 years ago, not dominance. Not fear, not aggression, recognition. The Sketh closest to her stopped their charge and began circling, their antennae waving as they tried to process this strange creature that did not run, and did not fight, and did not project the painful psychic energy that the others used. Yuna began walking slowly toward the swarm center, and the Sketh parted around her like water around a stone behind her. The entire battlefield had gone silent as hunters and colonists watched the impossible sight of a human woman walking untouched through thousands of creatures that had killed dozens of their people. She walked for what felt like hours. Though it was probably only minutes, the swarm grew denser around her, and she felt their presence like pressure against her skin. Thousands of alien minds focused on this single small being who moved among them without fear. At the swarm's center, she found what she was looking for, a Sketh queen, larger than any individual she had seen, surrounded by workers who attended to something. Buried in the earth beneath her, Yuna approached slowly and lowered herself to the ground. The queen watched her with eyes that held more intelligence than the consortium's classifications would ever acknowledge, and Yuna understood the construction. Vibrations from the colony's expansion had been destroying something precious, something the Sketh had built long before any colonist arrived. Underground nurseries where thousands of eggs waited to hatch. The Sketh were not attacking the colony out of predatory instinct. They were defending their children. "I see you," Yuna whispered. Though she knew the queen could not understand her words, "I see what you are protecting." She sat in the dirt among creatures that should have killed her and let them see that she understood. 17 minutes passed while the queen circled and watched and made clicking sounds that might have been language. Then slowly, the Sketh began to withdraw. The assault on the colony barriers stopped as creatures turned away from the fight and followed their queen back toward the wilderness. Within an hour, the siege was over. The surviving colonists emerged from their shelters to find the swarm gone, and Uniseo sitting alone in the trampled earth outside the perimeter. Covered in dust and completely unharmed, Commander Hessek reached her first. "What happened?" he demanded, though his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Yuna looked up at him with exhausted eyes. "They were not monsters," she said quietly. "They were parents, and we were killing their children without ever knowing they existed." She pointed toward the colony's eastern expansion zone, where construction equipment sat silent. The tunneling for the new residential sector was destroying their nurseries. The vibrations were collapsing underground chambers where their eggs were stored, and they could not make a stop any other way. Hessek stared at her for a long moment. "You are saying this entire siege was a communication attempt?" "I am saying they were screaming at us the only way they knew how," Yuna replied. "And we could not hear them because we were too busy shouting back." News of what had happened at Vareth Colony spread faster than any official report could contain. A human woman with zero resonance ability had walked alone into a swarm of creatures that had killed 200 teams and somehow convinced them to leave the Dominion Doctrine, which declared communication with hostile fauna impossible, had been proven wrong in the most public and undeniable way imaginable. Director Valeth received the reports in her office on Station Corin 7, and her crystalline eyes grew cold with fury. She began drafting new orders, ones that would ensure this embarrassment was contained before it could spread any further. The recording of Yuna and the Void Maw spread through the Academy network within hours, and by the next morning it had reached the administrative offices of the Galactic Consortium itself. Director Valeth of the Colonial Expansion Bureau watched the footage 17 times in her private office, her crystalline Sauron eyes reflecting the image of a human woman sitting peacefully beside a creature that had killed experienced hunters. She did not like what she saw. The consortium's expansion across the galaxy had been built on a simple principle called the Dominion Doctrine. Sentient species were superior to non-sentient creatures by virtue of their intelligence and psychic capabilities, and this superiority gave them the right to claim any world they desired. Creatures that resisted colonization were classified as hostile fauna to be eliminated or contained. The entire system depended on one fundamental assumption, that communication with these creatures was impossible. If a human woman with zero resonance ability could make a void maw lie down beside her like a pet, that assumption was suddenly in question. Director Lilith summoned her assistant and began drafting orders for Station Corinth 7. Meanwhile, at the Academy, Class Omega-12 had become the most watched group in the institution's history. Students from every class found excuses to observe their training sessions, and opinions divided sharply. Some believed that Yuna had discovered a revolutionary new technique that could transform how hunters operated. Others insisted that she had simply gotten lucky multiple times and that her luck would eventually run out in fatal fashion. Commander Hasek found himself in an uncomfortable position. His duty required him to report that Class Omega-12 was failing all standard metrics, but his eyes had seen things that standard metrics could not measure. He chose to remain silent and observe. Yuna continued teaching her classmates the principles she had learned during her 11 days alone on Vareth 6. Every creature has things it fears and things it wants, she explained during one of their unofficial sessions. Resonance projection tells them to fear you, but it tells them nothing about what you want. And creatures do not trust things they cannot understand. Kirath's mandibles clicked thoughtfully as he processed this. So instead of making them fear us, we show them we are not a threat. More than that, Yuna said, we show them that we see them, that we recognize them as living beings with their own purposes and needs. And that recognition creates a connection that fear can never build. Drun nodded his great gray head, his gentle eyes warm with understanding. My people have always believed this about other sentient species, he rumbled. We never thought to apply it to creatures the consortium calls monsters. That is because the consortium decided they were monsters before anyone tried talking to them. Yuna replied quietly. Word of these conversations reached certain ears that did not approve. 3 weeks after the Void Maw incident, Director Valeth arrived at Station Corinth 7 with a delegation of consortium officials and a security detail that made the Academy's staff nervous. She demanded an immediate meeting with Academy leadership and the student in question. Yuna was summoned to the administrative conference room, where she found herself facing Director Valeth across a long polished table while Commander Hasek and other Academy officials watched from the sides. You have caused quite a disturbance, Director Valeth began, her forelegs folded elegantly beneath her as she studied Yuna with cold eyes. The footage of your exhibition has spread far beyond this academy. I was not aware that successfully completing an evaluation exercise was considered a disturbance. Yuna replied calmly. Director Valeth's crystalline eyes flickered with irritation. You did not complete the exercise. You performed a spectacle that has raised uncomfortable questions about consortium policy. What questions? The director leaned forward slightly. The Dominion Doctrine is the foundation of our expansion across the galaxy, and it rests on the principle that sentient species cannot communicate meaningfully with hostile fauna. But your little performance suggests otherwise. Yuna considered her response carefully. I did not communicate with the Void Maw in any way that a hunter would recognize. I simply did not threaten it, and when it realized I was not a threat, it had no reason to attack. That is precisely the problem, Director Valeth said coldly. If creatures only attack because they perceive us as threats, then our entire approach to colonization becomes morally questionable. Silence filled the conference room as the implications of that statement settled over everyone present. Commander Hessek spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Director, with respect, we have been killing these creatures for thousands of years. And if there was an alternative approach that could save both hunter lives and creature lives, would that not be worth exploring? Director Valith turned her cold gaze toward him. The consortium does not pay for alternatives that undermine established doctrine. Commander, we pay for results that support our expansion goals. She turned back to Yuna. Your methods cannot be replicated by standard training protocols because they depend on some peculiarity of human psychology that we do not understand. And techniques that cannot be systematized have no institutional value. My classmates are learning them. Yuna said quietly, a handful of failures teaching each other to fail differently is not a curriculum. Director Valith replied dismissively, I am recommending that you be removed from this academy before your influence spreads further. Commander Hessek stood abruptly. You cannot expel a student for succeeding at an evaluation exercise. I can recommend whatever I choose to recommend, the director replied. The final decision rests with the Academy Board, but my recommendations carry significant weight. The meeting ended without resolution. But Yuna understood what had really happened. She had threatened something more important than the Academy's training methods. She had threatened the story that the consortium told itself about its right to take whatever it wanted from the galaxy. That evening, Class Omega-12 gathered in their usual meeting space, and Yuna shared what had happened. They may expel me, she said simply, and if they do, everything we have been building here will probably be dismantled. Kireth's clicking became agitated. That is not fair. You have done nothing wrong. I have done something worse than wrong, Yuna replied with a sad smile. I have been right in a way that makes powerful people uncomfortable. Drung placed one massive gentle hand on her shoulder. Then we must show them that your rightness cannot be ignored. Before Yuna could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights flashed red as Commander Hessek's voice came over the communication system. All students report to assembly areas immediately. We have received a priority distress call from a colonial outpost under siege. Full deployment is authorized. Class Omega-12 looked at each other in the flashing emergency lights. Siege by what? Mira asked with all four arms wrapped around herself. Yuna felt something cold settle in her stomach because she already knew the answer. The distress call was coming from Colony Verith. The replacement settlement that had been built after her original colony was destroyed. The creatures that had killed 47 of her colleagues 3 years ago had returned, and this time, they were not just attacking. They were coming in numbers that no hunter force had ever faced before. 3 years before she arrived at the Hunter Academy, Yuna SEO had been an agricultural specialist on Colony Vera 6. A small settlement on the edge of consortium space, the planet had been classified as low threat. With only minor fauna that standard security measures could handle, the consortium classification had been wrong. On the 47th day of settlement, creatures emerged from underground tunnels that no survey had detected. And within hours the colony's defensive barriers had fallen. Yuna remembered the screaming, the chaos. The sight of her colleagues being dragged into darkness by things with too many legs and too many teeth. She remembered running until her lungs burned, hiding in a collapsed structure while creatures prowled outside. And making a decision that saved her life, she stopped running in the 11 days that followed, alone in monster territory with no weapons and no rescue coming. Yuna learned to watch and listen and understand. She learned that certain creatures only attacked moving targets. So she became still. She learned that others responded to eye contact as a threat. So she learned when to look and when to look away, she learned that some creatures could be avoided entirely if you moved through their territory the right way, acknowledging their space without challenging it. By the time rescue teams finally found her, she had walked through areas that should have killed her dozens of times over. The official report listed her survival as unexplained anomaly. Yuna knew better. She had survived because she learned to listen to conversations that no one else could hear. Now, standing in the restricted habitat with a Kethstalker resting beside her like an enormous guard dog, she understood that her survival had not been luck or anomaly. It had been the discovery of something the Consortium had never considered. The resonance projection that hunters used was essentially psychic shouting, overwhelming creatures with dominance until they submitted or fled. But creatures had been communicating with each other for millions of years before sentient species evolved, using body language and scent and sound in ways that required no psychic ability at all. Yuna had learned to speak that older language. When morning came and she returned to the barracks, Kirith was waiting for her with worry in his compound eyes. "You were gone," he clicked softly. "I did not report you, but I was afraid. I needed to practice something," Yuna replied. "And I think I'm ready to teach it to you." Their official training continued under Fotund, and I think I am ready to teach it to you. Their official training continued under Shichid to you. Commander Hessek's dismissive supervision. And Class Omega-12 continued to fail every standard exercise, but during their free hours, Yuna began gathering her classmates in quiet corners of the station to share what she had learned. Forget about resonance, she told them. You do not have it, and you will never have it. So stop trying to compete with species that do. Drun nodded his massive head in agreement while Kirith clicked nervously. What else is there? Asked a small Therian named Mira, her forearms crossed in skepticism. There is something older, Yuna said. Every creature in the galaxy is having a conversation all the time, through how they move and how they breathe and how they hold their bodies. And most hunters never learn to listen because they are too busy shouting. She began with simple exercises, teaching her classmates to control their breathing and their movements, to become still without becoming tense, to observe without staring. Kirith's tendency to freeze was reframed not as weakness, but as a valuable skill. The ability to become so motionless that movement triggered predators would ignore him completely. Drun's pacifism became an asset because wounded creatures could sense his lack of hostile intent and would allow him to approach when they would attack anyone else. Myra's small size and multiple arms made her perfect for the subtle gestures that certain species used to communicate non-threat during their next official exercise. Something strange happened, class. Omega-12 was placed in an arena with a moderate threat creature and told to use resonance to drive it toward a containment zone. They failed to project anything, as expected, but the creature did not attack them. It wandered through the arena, ignoring them completely, occasionally glancing at Yuna as if checking to make sure she was still there, and eventually walked into the containment zone on its own. Commander Hessek watched from the observation deck with an expression that was difficult to read. He called Yuna to his office after training hours. Your test scores show 0 resonance ability, he said without preamble. Yet creatures behave differently around you than around anyone else I have observed in 30 years. Yuna remained silent, waiting. I am assigning additional monitoring to your training sessions, Hessek continued. I want to understand what you are doing. I'm not doing anything, Yuna replied calmly. I'm just not doing the things that make creatures attack. Hessek studied her for a long moment before dismissing her word, began spreading through the academy in whispers. Students from higher classes started appearing near Class Omega-12's training areas. Watching from corridors and observation windows, they saw a group of supposed failures moving through creature habitats without using resonance, without fighting, without fear, Some laughed and called it luck. Others were not so sure when the next evaluation period arrived. All students were required to demonstrate their progress in a live arena exercise. Class Alpha went first, and their display of psychic dominance was impressive, with creatures cowering and fleeing before the combined resonance of 24 elite trainees. Class Omega 12 went last. They entered the arena together and spread out in a loose formation that Yuna had designed, with each member positioned according to their specific skills. The creature released into the arena was a juvenile void maw, a species known for relentless aggression that had killed 12 hunters in the current training cycle alone. It should have attacked immediately instead. It paused at the arena's center and looked around at the strange collection of beings surrounding it. Kireth stood frozen in perfect stillness, invisible to the creature's motion triggered. Hunting instincts drawn projected calm. Acceptance that made the creature's threat assessment systems register him as non-hostile. Myra made subtle gestures with her forearms that signaled submission without weakness. And Yuna walked slowly toward the void maw, with her eyes slightly lowered and her posture open. The creature watched her approach. The entire academy watched. Through broadcast screens, Yuna stopped 3 meters from the most dangerous creature in the training program, lowered herself to the ground, and waited. The void maw circled her once, twice, 3 times. Then it lay down beside her and became still. Silence filled the academy as thousands of students and instructors tried to process what they had just witnessed. Commander Hessek stood in the fear observation room with his scarred hands gripping the railing. And for the first time in 30 years, he did not know what to think. The creature remained docile until handlers arrived with containment equipment. And even then it only moved because Yuna stood and walked away first after the arena cleared. Kireth approached Yuna with something like awe in his clicking voice. "How did you know it would not attack you?" Yuna looked back at the containment area where the void maw was being sedated for transport. "I did not know," she admitted, "but I understood something about it that no one else here understands." "What?" "That it was not a monster," Yuna said softly. "It was just an animal that no one had ever tried to talk to." In the weeks that followed, Class Omega 12 began transforming from the Academy's greatest embarrassment into something that no one could quite explain. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Consortium, officials were starting to take notice of the human woman who could make monsters listen. The transport shuttle descended through pale clouds towards Station Corinth 7, and Yuna pressed her palm against the cold window to watch the massive orbital facility grow larger beneath her. She had traveled for 3 weeks across 4 different relay stations to reach the Galactic Hunter Academy, and every species she encountered along the way had given her the same look. When they learned she was human, pity mixed with confusion. Humans had only joined the consortium 12 years ago, and in that time they had earned a reputation as one of the weakest sentient species in known space. No natural weapons, no psychic abilities, no exceptional strength or speed, just soft skin and stubborn determination. The shuttle docked with a gentle shudder, and Yuna gathered her single bag before joining the stream of recruits flowing into the station. Creatures of every shape surrounded her in the boarding area. Tall insectoid Velith clicked their mandibles nervously, while massive Torvan warriors stood like statues carved from gray stone. Delicate Sauron glided past on their 4 legs, their crystalline eyes reflecting the harsh station lights, and scattered among them, looking small and fragile, walked the handful of other humans who had been foolish enough to apply. A booming voice echoed through the chamber as a scarred Torvan in military armor stepped onto a raised platform. "Welcome to the Hunter Academy," he announced without warmth. "I am Commander Hessek, and I will be overseeing your evaluation and class assignments today." Yuna studied him carefully as he spoke about the Academy's history and purpose. The Galactic Consortium had expanded across thousands of worlds over the past 10,000 years. And many of those worlds contained hostile fauna that threatened colonization efforts. Hunters were the elite operatives trained to clear these creatures, using a combination of combat skills and psychic projection to subdue or eliminate threats. The key to everything was something called the Resonance Index. You will now proceed to testing. Commander Hasek continued. Your resonance scores will determine your class placement and your future in this institution. Yuna followed the crowd into a vast circular chamber where dozens of testing stations had been arranged in rows. Each station contained a small containment field holding a minor creature, and recruits were expected to project their psychic dominance to make the creature submit. She watched a Torvan recruit step up to his station, close his eyes in concentration, and release a wave of invisible pressure that made the creature inside flatten itself against the floor in terror. The score display lit up with impressive numbers when her turn came. Yuna stood before her assigned station and looked at the small reptilian creature trembling inside the containment field. It had 6 legs and scales that shifted color with its emotions. Currently a fearful gray, she was supposed to project dominance, to push her will against its mind until it recognized her as superior. Instead, she simply looked at it. The creature stopped trembling and tilted its head, and its scales shifted to a curious blue as it watched her watching it. Human female, a technician called out impatiently. Begin your projection. Yuna tried to do what the others had done. Tried to push some invisible force from her mind toward the creature. But nothing happened. The creature continued to watch her with what almost looked like interest. After 30 seconds of silence, the technician marked her score as 0 and waved her away. She was not surprised. The sorting ceremony took place that evening in the Academy's central amphitheater, where thousands of recruits sat in tiered seating while their names and class assignments were announced. The highest scorers were placed in Class Alpha, the elite training group that produced most of the consortium's legendary hunters. Below them came Beta, Gamma, Delta, and so on down the ranking. When Yuna's name was called, she heard the announcement she had expected. Yuna SEO Human, assigned to Class Omega 12. Scattered laughter rippled through the amphitheater from recruits who knew what that meant. Omega classes were where the Academy placed species deemed unsuitable for hunting, those who consistently failed to demonstrate usable resonance abilities. Class Omega 12 had a graduation rate of 2%. The other 98% either dropped out or were expelled within the first year. Yuna made her way to the section reserved for Omega students and found a seat beside a nervous Velith whose mandibles would not stop clicking. I am Kirith. He introduced himself in halting common speech. I scored very low because I freeze when creatures look at me. I am Yuna, she replied. I scored 0 because apparently humans cannot project at all. Kirith made a sound that might have been sympathetic laughter, and his clicking slowed slightly. On her other side sat an elderly Morkai, a large herbivore species with gentle eyes and thick gray fur. Drun, he said simply. My people do not believe in dominance, so I could not perform the test with conviction. Their instructor for Class Omega 12 was Commander Hasek himself, and when he stood before them the next morning in their small training room, his expression made clear what he thought of his assignment. I have trained alpha classes for 30 years, he said flatly. I have produced more successful hunters than any other instructor in Academy history. And now I have been given you. He paused to let that sink in. I expect nothing from you, and you will likely prove me correct. But regulations require that I provide you with the same training curriculum as every other class. Their first exercise involved entering a small arena where a mid-level predator had been contained, with the goal of using resonance projection to drive it into a corner. The Alpha students had completed this exercise in minutes, their combined psychic pressure overwhelming the creature effortlessly. Class Omega 12 failed immediately. Kirith froze the moment the creature turned toward him, and Drun refused to project hostile intent on moral grounds. The other students scattered in panic when the creature charged, and only the safety barriers prevented injuries. Yuna alone remained still. The creature rushed toward her with teeth bared, and she did not run or scream or try to project anything at all. She simply stood her ground and met its eyes. 3 meters from her, the creature stopped. It sniffed the air, circled her once, and then walked past her as if she were part of the furniture. Commander Hessek observed this from the control room with narrowed eyes but said nothing that night. After her classmates had fallen asleep in their shared barracks, Yuna slipped out through a maintenance corridor she had memorized during orientation. She made her way to the restricted training habitats on the station's lower levels, areas where dangerous creatures were kept for advanced exercises. The security systems did not detect her entry because she moved with the patience of someone who had learned that haste attracted predators inside the habitat. Darkness wrapped around her like a familiar blanket, and she heard something large moving through the artificial underbrush. A Keth stalker emerged from the shadows, a creature responsible for more hunter deaths than almost any other species in the consortium's records. It stood twice her height, with blade-like limbs and eyes that could see heat signatures in total darkness. Yuna did not run. She lowered herself slowly to the ground, kept her breathing steady, and projected something that no hunter had ever been trained to project. Not dominance or fear or aggression. Acknowledgement. The Keth stalker approached her with its killing limbs raised, and Yuna continued to breathe, continued to wait, continued to recognize it as a living thing worthy of recognition. Seconds passed that felt like hours. Then the creature lowered its limbs, settled onto the ground beside her, and became still in the darkness of the restricted habitat, surrounded by one of the deadliest creatures in known space. Yuna smiled softly. She had spent 11 days alone on a death world after her colony fell, and in those 11 days she had learned something that the entire Galactic Consortium had never figured out. Monsters were not enemies to be conquered. They were conversations waiting to happen.